Hello, everyone. This is part 2 of week 1 of Plato, a class on the Protagoras, Phaedo, and Sophist. We are beginning to think our way into the Protagoras, and we already covered in the first recording that Socrates is skeptical of the idea that virtue is teachable. But Protagoras, who is this famous sophist and who claims to teach virtue, of course, to some extent depends for his livelihood on the idea that virtue is indeed teachable, because that is what people pay him for. But he's also committed to it philosophically, and Protagoras is a really interesting philosopher. That is an important thing to understand, even though often the thought is, well, the sophists are portrayed as these, somehow, to some extent, even bad guys. On the other end of the spectrum from Socrates is always committed to these very lofty ideals, and the sophists, on the other hand, seem to be committed to ideas about power, to ideas about, pursuing one's own interest, and so on and so forth. However, Protagoras is not just sort of your ordinary sophist. He is someone whom both Plato and Aristotle take enormously seriously, and they devote a lot of space in their writings to engaging with Protagoras' ideas. Now, Protagoras responds to Socrates' challenge that virtue is not teachable. And it was part of Socrates' idea that, well, if something is teachable, there ought to be teachers. Where are they? Here's my, friend, the young student. I would like to give him good advice where he should go to, find a good teacher to become a good person. But it's just not clear where he would go. And if that is the case, then at least it looks kind of prima facie that virtue is not teachable. Now, Protagoras gives a long speech in response, which is called the Great Speech in the secondary literature. And that speech contains a number of arguments, which in my view are extraordinarily interesting arguments, and arguments that Plato takes quite seriously. And they, in fact, are arguments that resonate with debates in ethics until today. Now, I only want to talk about 2 of these arguments today, and I call them the argument from lying and the argument from language. And I think they are somewhat related, even though the argument from lying comes up at the beginning of Protagoras' speech. And then the argument from language is kind of at the end of the speech. Now, Protagoras says that here's an interesting phenomenon about lying. If someone tells you they are a doctor and they aren't, they are just, a charlatan, you're mad at them. And the same applies to other kinds of expertise. If someone tells you they know how to, sail safely to another place and they are not an expert in sailing, then you are very upset with them because you would trust the safety, let's say, of your cargo to that person, and the person doesn't know what they are doing. So in general, Protagoras thinks that the Athenians get mad, or maybe people in general get mad at those who claim to have some expertise that in fact they don't have. But he thinks that people have a different response when someone claims to be a good person while not really being a good person. Somehow we forgive that kind of lie, he thinks. He thinks that people almost expect that lie. As if, if someone were to say, well, I'm a bad person, that is just not something that we expect anyone to say. And we forgive them if they say they are a just or good person, even if they aren't. Now, it's an interesting question why Plato would include that argument, because you might think, well, that is kind of the last thing that either Socrates or Plato would accept. Surely they are committed to the idea that being a good person is the single most important thing. And we should not deceive either ourselves or others about that, because that is just not the sort of thing about which falsity is at all a minor issue. So why would Plato even entertain this argument? Now, I want to return to this at the end of this recording and first turn to this other argument, which I call the argument from language. Protagoras proposes that the reason why we are not finding teachers for virtue, except of course him, because he's kind of the best, but in general, we are not really finding teachers for virtue. And why is that? Because everyone is a teacher for virtue. And learning to be a good person, learning to be virtuous is like learning your native language. You live in a society, in a human community. And to some extent, everyone is a teacher of the language for you because you grow into that language. And that, he thinks, is also how we become virtuous. And that is a really momentous proposal because one thing that it means is that really everyone who is at all a member of human community is at least to some extent virtuous or just, even if not like fully or not excellently so. But the mere fact that you grow up among human beings and with human interaction in a human community, the thought is, means that you acquire a certain level of virtue and justice. And that thought has been spelled out from a different perspective by Barbara Herrmann very recently. And she speaks, and I think that is an interesting phrase, of moral literacy, where the thought is that if someone grows up, as it were, with the wolves outside of human community, that would be not being virtuous, because that would be a condition where you cannot acquire any kind of typical attitudes of relating to other people, feeling their pain, having sympathy, or any of that. But once you grow up in a human community, that already gives you a certain measure of being a good person, even if not yet excellence. Now, I think that is a very serious proposal and one that Plato takes very seriously. And we can return to the argument about lying with that in mind and ask ourselves whether maybe the thought that it is forgivable if someone doesn't say, oh, I'm a bad guy, is that it would almost be like pulling oneself out of human community, like making oneself a persona non grata in a community when, of course, one wants to be somehow, one wants to have access to that community. So to speak about oneself as at least to some extent virtuous or good might A, not be false for anyone who is at all a member of a human community, which I think is an interesting proposal. And B, it might just be too much to ask for anyone to, as it were, kick themselves out of human community by describing themselves as bad.